On Monday this week, President Biden made a surprise visit to Ukraine's capital, Kyiv, pledging the United States' unwavering commitment to supporting Ukraine in a dramatic show of resolve almost 1 year into Russia's full-scale invasion. It's actually Biden's first visit to Ukraine since the war began, and the whole event was shrouded in secrecy. The White House alerted Moscow of Biden's travel plans several hours before the president arrived in Ukraine in an effort to de-conflict with Russian forces operating in the country, according to Jake Sullivan, Biden's national security advisor. On Monday morning, though, the air raid siren was triggered due to a Russian MiG-31 fighter jet taking off in Belarus, which shares a border with Ukraine to the north. A missile fired from a MiG-31 aircraft in Belarus could reach a target in Kyiv in under 20 minutes. On Sunday, the day before Biden's visit, some Twitter sources already reported that something big is about to take place, as there was an increased number of NATO aircraft patrolling in Poland and Romania, possibly scouting around for any possible threats that President Biden may face during his train journey from Poland to Ukraine. So, here is why the visit is important. In his speech, Biden pledged to provide $500 million in military aid to Ukraine in the near future. This package should include artillery ammunition, Javelin missiles, and howitzers. However, the president did not mention any of the more advanced weaponry that Ukraine has been asking for, though, such as frequently requested fighter jets and long-range weapons, which Ukraine needs to combat the escalating Russian aggression in the east. But even though no advanced weapons were pledged by the U.S., the symbolic significance of this visit was probably more crucial for Ukraine than any arm delivery announcement before. Look, this really does not happen every day. The U.S. president really stood next to Volodymyr Zelensky wearing a striped tie in the colors of the Ukrainian flag, in a city that, despite not being directly on the front line, is still often being targeted by missile attacks from Russia. In another act of NATO's strong position as a true ally of Ukraine, Germany's defense minister, Boris Pistorius, visited an army tank training center in Münster, where Ukrainian soldiers are currently being trained on the German-made Leopard 2A6 battle tanks and the Marder armored infantry fighting vehicle. He promised the delivery of these vehicles to Ukraine will happen by the end of March, which is really good news for Ukraine, especially as fighting is about to get really intense in spring, according to war analysts. Both sides are reportedly in preparation for an offensive. Russia did not hesitate to use this news in their propaganda, using it as supposed evidence of the United States waging a proxy war against Russia in Ukraine, and claiming that it's America who is Moscow's true adversary. Commentators on Russian state television discuss this narrative, with one analyst on Russia's state-run Channel 1, Vasyl Vakharov, claiming that the U.S. is being forced to take a leading role in the conflict and present itself as a participant in the war. Vakharov further claimed that President Biden's statements during his visit show that Russia supposedly has no other option but to engage in the conflict. Putin's regime has been ramping up its propaganda machine recently, repeatedly asserting that Russia is engaged in a full-scale war against colonialist NATO forces, falsely characterizing Ukraine as being under the control of Nazis, and claiming that the Kremlin is actually, believe it or not, working on the best interests of the Ukrainian people. On state-run talk shows, various analysts further denounced Ukraine's leader, President Volodymyr Zelensky, as nothing more than a puppet of President Biden, and portrayed Biden's visit as a mere publicity stunt, staged by the American leader in advance of his announcement of seeking a second term in office. We have actually deep-dived into Russian propaganda narratives in a recent video, so if you want to know more, be sure to check it out. So, now to the second part of today's video, where we will go over what is new on the battlefield. With the first anniversary of Russia's invasion of Ukraine drawing near, Russia's military has faced numerous defeats and failed to achieve its objective of dominating Ukraine. However, the grievances and expansionist mentality that led Vladimir Putin to invade Ukraine have become ingrained in Russian society, bolstering the power and influence of the Russian leader. Prior to the war, Putin had presented himself as a peaceful president who would not initiate an attack on any other nation. However, he has framed the conflict in Ukraine as a battle against Nazis, who are supported by Western countries. He has also depicted the invasion as a quasi-religious crusade for Russia's fundamental identity. proclaiming that the nation is fighting to resist the imposition of liberal gender norms and the acceptance of homosexuality by a belligerent West. And yeah, we don't have to tell you how dumb and not even well thought through narratives these are. But why does Putin have to resort to such obscure claims? Well, see, lately, there have been signs that Russia is at least preparing or already starting an offensive around Donbass. Increased troop and equipment concentration has been primarily seen around the city of Bakhmut and Soledar, where Russian forces have seen at least minor gains after months of retreating. The Russian army has definitely tried to use its newly mobilized manpower to its advantage to push deeper into the Donetsk region, but things are seemingly not going according to Putin's plan. The Battle of Vuhledar turned out to be disastrous, with satellite images and videos directly from the front showing dozens of infantry fighting vehicles and tanks being destroyed by the Ukrainians, be it direct fire or mines. But something more might be coming. The Kremlin also drastically increased its military expenditure in January by 59%, literally almost 2/3 more than expected, probably in preparation for something costly, likely the offensive. It is only natural for Russian generals to conduct such an offensive now, since the longer they wait, the less likely it is that the Russian army is going to be able to break through the fortifications that Ukraine had time to build during the winter. But there is another problem with the offensive, which is so desired by Putin, and frankly, also needed for Putin to stay in his position. Russian logistics are famously poor to begin with, but we must say that in the first few months of fighting, Russia did have the advantage of using vast amounts of equipment. It had accumulated at its and Belarusian bases in Ukraine's vicinity. But the last couple of months proved that the Russian army really struggles with supplying new soldiers and equipment to the front line. You see, Russia started building up tanks, infantry fighting vehicles, and all necessary military equipment alongside hundreds of thousands of troops at military bases in Russia and Belarus, bases which were, of course, in Ukraine's vicinity. But as Ukraine's fierce resistance made the Russian invasion much more equipment-hungry, Russian stockpiles of military equipment started drying up rapidly, forcing Russia to those infamous, humiliating retreats from Kherson and Kharkiv last year. As we have seen, Russia lacks the formerly believed qualitative advantage over the Ukrainians, so the only way for the Russian forces to make gains is to use their manpower advantage, given to them by the newly mobilized soldiers and the Wagner Group mercenaries. The minor gains around Bakhmut were redeemed by massive losses on the Russian side. Russian soldiers simply had to overwhelm the Ukrainians to make any progress. But Russia should not really rely on this advantage. Here's why. Despite the last year's mobilization, Russia's manpower advantage is simply not that significant. And in case you ever need this information, whenever you attack a country, you should have at least 3 attacking soldiers for every defending soldier. So even though Russia has more troops than Ukraine, Russia's advantage is simply not as significant as would be needed. Given the bad logistics we discussed earlier and a shortage of modern weapons, it is clear why Russian forces have only been able to make very minor gains. As many Russian civilians are starting to be exposed to the fact that many of their friends and relatives are simply not returning from the front lines alive, another wave of mobilization would be very, very difficult for Putin to justify. The same applies to the Wagner Group, a mercenary group mainly consisting of convicts, whose death rate is much higher than that of the conventional Russian forces, with as little as 20% of the soldiers actually surviving. Well, this all looks disastrous for Putin, purely because of the fact that we're here having trouble working out whether this actually is the offensive or not. Beautifully demonstrates the weakness of the Russian forces. With the famous Ukrainian spring mud coming in late March, Putin really has to act now or wait until summer. And Ukraine is definitely not just going to sit and wait for Russia's next move, as they will start receiving Western tanks in 1 or 2 months. They will likely launch an offensive of their own. With newly mobilized Russian soldiers and Ukraine receiving more Western weapons than ever before, it is difficult for us to tell who will have the upper hand. That's it for today. If you enjoyed this video, be sure to like, subscribe, and visit our channel for more videos talking about the geopolitical situation in Russia and Ukraine. And have a good one.